Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NowSecure Tech Talk for April. My name is Brendan Hahn, Senior Product Marketing Manager here at NowSecure, and I'll be your host for today. I'm joined by Jason, the CTO of Mindgrub, to discuss security best practices when using AI to write code. A few quick housekeeping items before we start. We will have Q&A at the end of the Tech Talk today, so please feel free to ask any questions you have with the Q&A Zoom feature. We will also have chat enabled in today's session, so folks can chat with one another or with us. And we host these Tech Talks monthly. So on the registration site where you registered for today's session, you can also register for upcoming Tech Talks as well. With that, Jason, I will hand it over to you.
Hello, thank you all for joining me. I'm super excited to be here. I am Jason Michael Perry. I like to say the man with three first names. I'm the CTO at a company called Mindgrub Technologies based in Baltimore. Mindgrub is a consulting company as well as an agency. We do quite a bit of work in the AI space. This includes some things that you can see at our mindgrub.ai website. We have some implementations on top of ChatGPT that we're working on. We're also doing a lot of tools, building models, looking at emotions with AI and trying to figure out using information like reviews, what are the semantics about people's feelings. So we're exploring AI, but we're also a company for hire to build applications, mobile apps, websites, and all of those types of solutions. So if you have a need, please be in touch. Now, that's it. We're going to talk a lot about AI, and our goal here is to really explore the different tools that are available when you're creating generative AI code in your projects and your applications. We're going to explore some of the ways that you can do that, but we're also going to take a step back and look at security concerns that you should just have for AI as a whole, and some of the things that you need to know about the landscape. After that, we're going to drill specifically into ChatGPT as a generative tool for AI, as well as GitHub's Copilot. I'll talk about some other options there, but those are the ones that we're going to really get into. And the last thing is, well, what do we do? Now we understand the security concerns that come with generative AI. How can you and your organization prepare to actually manage and deal with that? So to get started, I always love to talk about the types of AI that are there. But right quickly, I think it's important to just think about why we need to worry about code security when we're talking about AI and generative AI. This is a great XKCD comic. I find this one to be particularly hilarious. So if you haven't a chance to read it, definitely take a look. But this is about SQL injection and just making sure that you're sanitizing your variables or validating variables before they come into a function. And by doing that, we can make sure that we're eliminating particular threat vulnerability in our applications. Some of the biggest concerns that we have around generative AI are making sure that our junior engineers and non-engineers that are developing and working on production projects using the code that are coming from these tools, that they're not making these types of mistakes, or nowadays that these generative tools aren't making these types of mistakes. And as we're going to talk a lot about, these tools are trained on human code and humans make mistakes. And so just innately, they're going to be these types of issues that we're dealing with as we're building AI and generative code. Now, first things up, there are two different types of AI. There is this idea of a AGI, and there's also this idea of traditional artificial intelligence as maybe you're used to thinking of it. Now, AI is typically fairly narrow, and it's narrow because it's trained on a subset of information and data. What that means is that if I want to create an AI that's going to be the best programmer, then maybe what I'll do is create a data set, like all the code in GitHub, and I'll train using that specific data set. This creates an artificial intelligence that really understands with a level of depth how to write and develop code. But what it's lacking are all the general things that are out there. If you think about your college programs, the whole idea is to create us as well-rounded people, right? Not to put someone in a computer science program without also making sure they understand history and art, and, as well as other sciences. An AGI really represents that. It's creating a general intelligence that understands a whole lot of different things, not necessarily with the same level of depth in any of those particular subjects. So an AGI may understand art, may understand science, history, design techniques, movies, the ability to develop and program across a multitude of different languages, But it really has a general knowledge. We can take those things and can tap into different pieces and bring it together to explore how to deal with a problem set. So when we think about these, it really becomes important when we look at the landscape of where AI is for our developers. So quickly, some of the different AI tools that are out there include things like GitHub's Copilot. GitHub's Copilot is trained using the OpenAI model. And it's also, if you don't know now, Microsoft owns GitHub, so it's also a Microsoft product, and is subject to this large partnership that Microsoft has had with OpenAI for several years now. Using OpenAI, Microsoft has created a product called Copilot that's trained on this repository of millions, if not billions, of merge requests and code across all the different projects that are stored within GitHub. This includes some of the largest open source projects that are out there, Drupal, WordPress. All this information is being used to then train this model. And using that, Copilot then provides us with an IDE plugin that we can use with tools like Visual Studio that can then provide suggestions. I like to think of it as IntelliSense on steroids. Some people like to think of Clippy back in the day, and this is kind of like that new version of Clippy that's built into your IDE and that allows it to write code for us. It's generated based on what it assumes you may need. We'll see some examples of this, but in some cases, you may write a comment describing what you expect the function to do, and using that, Copilot can then generatively create a large function of code that you can then work on. Code Whisperer is a similar product that's based off of AWS's own variation of this. If you're not familiar, AWS also provides Git repositories similar to GitHub, and it's used those Git repositories to also train its own AI to work with this. And so these two tools are traditional artificial intelligence in that they're trained on a model that's specifically around programming and development. In addition to that, we also have ChatGPT, which is also an OpenAI-based tool. And ChatGPT, of course, has been all the rage. I do like to make sure that I separate ChatGPT, which is currently using GPT-3, as opposed to GPT, which gives you a series of different models, including GPT-4, which you can access using APIs, and I believe using the pro version of ChatGPT in some instances. But it is an AGI, or a general intelligence. And because of that, ChatGPT allows you to ask a whole lot of different types of questions. You're not limited to just programming questions. You can ask it about its feelings or the world, or why the sky is blue. And that's very different than the types of things that Copilot or Code Whisperer can do. Now, the landscape is incredibly fertile. And if you're watching any of the news on AI, you know that there's a new development literally every single day. It seems like this, it's the wild, wild west. Things are happening incredibly quickly. But some of the other tools that are out there are things like CodeWP. CodeWP is a tool that's been trained on tons of plugins that are open source in the WordPress world that will allow you to very quickly get that same type of intelligence for WordPress type projects, but also almost generate a full plugin or all the code that you need to write for WordPress very quickly. So these more specific AIs are being developed by a lot of individuals, sometimes using tools like OpenAI. So the landscape is changing very quickly. Now, all of this is really, ultimately about AI and what does it mean for us in terms of security. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about writing code and generative AI code. But before we get there, it's also important to understand that AI has really changed the landscape in a lot of different ways. And some of our concerns are just about what this means and having artificial intelligence as a security vector or as a threat. An example of this is an AI-powered credential stuffing tool. Now, if you're not familiar with this or what credential stuffing means, if you were to go into the dark web and scour the dark web for one of those infamous hacks that have happened over a large platform, someone has downloaded a whole slew of usernames and passwords. In a lot of cases, hackers on the dark web have maybe tons and tons of these databases of usernames and passwords, and they may attempt to create automated attacks that hit APIs, or we use the username or login page to attempt to authenticate. Some of the tools that are out there that are now AI powered are allowing AI to better understand which passwords may work, which passwords may not work, and to actually look at this information and intelligently decide how to do these credential stuffing attacks. If you're taking a look here, PassGN, which I think I have a link to down at the bottom, it's an open source product that's hosted on GitHub, gives you the ability to do these types of credential stuffing attacks. And it's right there, open source, and the accuracy that it has in doing these is much greater than what we've seen before. And so we're finding that AI aided hacks and attacks are actually much better than what we've been able to do before as humans, because now we have these computers that are supporting these activities. One of the things that I think you've seen a lot in the press and a lot of articles is the idea of jailbreaking an AGI. With Bang search, if you've heard about her secret name or conversations where with the right prompting or the right prompt being written, you can get that search engine to talk and communicate and start to answer questions that was never really meant to answer. This is referred to as jailbreaking. It's a way to phrase something to an AGI like Bang or ChatGPT to then get it to respond in a way that was never meant to respond in the first place. There are a lot of things that the developers of these AI tools have put in place to try and make sure that they're not used for nefarious reasons. But as with anything, once you put something out there publicly into the world, it's really easy for us to figure out ways that we can then break these things apart and really attack it. That's what's happening right now. And this is essentially just like any form of warfare. As developers are making their AGIs more stronger and putting protections in place, developers are quickly finding ways to erode these different types of protections that are there. So I have a few different examples here of some AGI attacks here. So in this first case, you can see that there is a vulnerability, and this is a cross-script vulnerability that's there. This cross-site scripting vulnerability, we can ask it just by giving it the code, and ChatGPT knows what the issue is here. And with a little bit of prompting and jailbreaking, we can then get ChatGPT to then actually write code that will take advantage of this attack. And this becomes an amazing starter for us as hackers to then use this and have a way to easily exploit a cross-site scripting attack. Another example are the two that you see here. So these are cases where you may generate source code that may have issues or unexpected issues. Maybe they're password lines that are directly in line. That means that now when your developer goes in and takes this sample code and starts to use it in their project, suddenly we have direct passwords, API keys, or other items that you may not prefer to store inside of your Git repository for obvious security issues. There are also cases where you may get it to generate code that could be used for a nefarious reason just by writing something that doesn't sound like it's really nefarious. So in this right example, we have a text file that's full of credentials, maybe those that we downloaded from the dark web. Well, here we're saying, take this password.txt file that's full of a bunch of credentials, look through it, and then create something that's going to automatically try and create a credential stuffing attack or a login attack against a particular source. And so this is allowing us, without necessarily having the knowledge of how to take advantage of hacks, to then trick our AGIs into providing us with that ability and that functionality. This is something that we have to keep in mind, that these are the things and tools that are suddenly available to anyone. Another type of attack that we're going to become much more familiar with as these AIs are used more ubiquitously is the idea of poisoning the well. Give you an example, some of these AGIs may use information that comes from public sources like Wikipedia. Poisoning the well means that we can go to a Wikipedia article about a particular topic and we can start to make changes there, as well as other public sources that may store that same information. And by poisoning the source of the data that these AIs are actually using, we can then manipulate that AI long-term into providing responses that are different than those that are truthful. A common example of this that we're seeing with Bang is that a AI may respond back and say that X is a true statement. And then by providing it with sources on the internet that say that it's not, this can confuse the AI and start to make it wonder if what it understands or believes to be true, if it's really true based on the information and sources that's provided. There have been some really crazy examples of this, including one case where AI believed that the date was wrong and that it was actually 2 years ago. And some other scenarios where providing information or something that is given to it may make it think that something that is true is untrue or vice versa. So these manipulative attacks can start to change the core of the way that these AIs work for us. So one of the best ways to get into generative AI, especially if you're junior engineers are working with it, is to use something called ChatGPT. As we mentioned, ChatGPT is an AGI, it's a general AI. And because it's a general AI, that it's going to give us the ability to really pull from a lot of different sources, not just the code bases that it's been trained on. It knows more than just the GitHub repositories, but it can also tell us about a lot of different things. What I found is that this makes it incredibly useful for a lot of different scenarios. With ChatGPT, it can generate out some really amazing starter code. For some of the projects that I've needed to work on, I could say, hey, I need a login, sign up, I need a database. And by writing a prompt in the way that I'm looking for, it can immediately start to generate out all the different code, in some cases, multiple files that I need to then assemble and run. But it's really good at pulling a lot of different things together and understanding very broad questions. It can also, sometimes it feels like it can really do more than what you're expecting. It may understand that when you mention a book, what a book means, and then take that additional knowledge and use that to expound on things in a way that can really provide some unexpected results. What you're going to find is one of the big differences between OpenAI and some of the other specific generative tools for development is that OpenAI, because it is a general tool, it's not meant specifically for writing code. It just happens to also be able to do it. And this makes it very good for starter code and makes it also a very good solution if you need to ask a question and get back an example that you then need to kind of rewrite into the code base that you already have. But it doesn't integrate into a development tool per se. For a lot of junior engineers, I think this is a great way to pose a problem, get back a snippet of code, and then take that snippet of code or blocks of code, put that into a project, use it as a starter, and it can truly accelerate you and get you moving a lot quicker than a lot of different AIs are capable of doing. It can be incredibly useful. Some of the things that you would expect here in terms of the security concerns that we have just in terms of ChatGPT. It's important to remember that these are all trained off of code that's written by humans. And what I find happens very commonly in ChatGPT is that it will also give me back code that has vulnerabilities and issues with it. Sometimes it will generate code that has obvious SQL injection issues or cases where particular variables haven't been validated. But there are also cases within a login script where it will go out and pull a library, de-encrypt or some other tool, make sure it encrypts and salts passwords before those things get put in. So it can do a lot of great things. It's just not always as thorough. And you can get it to be better by defining the way that you write a prompt. Sometimes by telling it to do some things in a prompt, you can get back much more secure code than you would get back otherwise. But the important thing is that it's not always giving us back the most securely written code that's bulletproof. It's giving us back code that helps us answer the question, answers the question of what it is that we need. It's also potentially vulnerable to those jailbreaking issues where, depending on the phrasing, it can be used to do things that are actually nefarious in their actions. There is bias and discrimination that can impact the wording that comes back. There's also the cases of misinformation attacks where some of the information that's been given to it may not be correct. A lot of these are just common security issues around ChatGPT, but for us, the big thing is that the code that it generates is not always truly secure, and that's something that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. GitHub's Copilot as a tool is built with this idea of integrating with the IDE and being built to answer specific questions during development programming. So OpenAI is more of that general answers starter tool that helps you get what you need to get going. But once you're going and you're inside of a Copilot and IntelliJ, Visual Studios, or any of the IDEs that it currently supports, this is as you're writing code. And after you've already architected and determined the approach that you want to take. So in line, answering in a lot of cases, fairly specific questions or ways to implement a specific solution. All right. Now, I find this really useful, but I think it's important to take a step back and remember that with OpenAI's ChatGPT, it tends to be really great for building that starter. And in a lot of ways, that means that it's doing some of the initial architecture that you may need. So when I asked OpenAI to build that login or sign up script or to build some other form of application, it will provide a lot of the different assets and files, including files to generate a database. And it gives me an architecture that it kind of implies based on best practices for the language that I'm using. ChatGPT does that, whereas with Copilot, the assumption is you're doing a lot of that yourself. You're building out your starter application, and this is accelerating your development based on comments or what it believes you need to do in the context that you're writing. What I find with Copilot is that it will give you a large block of code that's been generated based on the assumptions of what it is that you need. And then you can go back and you can alter and edit it as you see fit. This also gives you some really cool tools that you can use to kind of jump between some of the code that's already been suggested for you, so that you can alter that code to meet your best practices and needs. So it can be an incredibly amazing accelerator. And it can also, just like IntelliSense, just provide you with this ability to get very quickly to where you want to get and where you need to get with a lot of ease. Now, with Copilot, there's been a lot of write-ups about some of the security concerns that pop up. And these are very similar to the things that we just talked about with ChatGPT. This is code that is being written based on the code that humans have written. And so those same types of vulnerabilities that we may accidentally write, those are some of the things that also pop up here. With both of these, there's some concerns about data privacy. As we're writing code, or as we are giving information that's being used to generate that code, this is typically being contributed to help train those models later on. There are ways to get enterprise licenses that restrict the amount of data that's being stored or shared. But we have to keep in mind that proprietary information can be leaked or given to these different models to be used in unexpected and nefarious ways. This can also impact intellectual property. And this is not just because of the code snippets that it generates, but with both tools, ChatGPT as well as with Copilot, it sometimes will make recommendations about libraries or external dependencies that get pulled in or are needed. More specifically with ChatGPT, this was a common thing that popped up where it would recommend a dependency to help do something in the case of TypeScript or JavaScript, but without necessarily providing information on the licensing requirements of that particular dependency that's being brought in, or if there are specific versions of that dependency that are being used in other places within the application. So there are unexpected things that did pop up when using Copilot as well as with OpenAI. Another thing that I also found with both of these tools is that sometimes the answers can be so robust that as an engineer, it takes a good bit of time to actually step through and see the responses that have been written to understand the impact of those responses or how those things may work. So this gets into the obvious question. We talked about these tools, like, what do we do? How does this really impact us? And how do we prepare ourselves for a world where we have so much generative code and that you have engineers who are going to be consistently using these tools to create code that your applications are working with? Well, the first thing that I think is incredibly important for us to remember is that we don't want to necessarily stop technology from happening. And we want to make sure that we create some form of balance between security and innovation. At Mindgrub, I find that it's incredibly important to allow our developers to explore and to take advantage of all these tools that are out there and to incorporate them. But what we're really pushing is for them to have an eye for the impacts and the places that we can do a little bit more to make sure that the generative code that we add into our projects are actually secure. And as I started talking with my team about the concerns that we have, we really realized that the things that we're already doing, the things that you should be doing as an organization right now, are the same things that can help prevent a lot of the concerns that you may have with generative AI. So to step through a few of these, the easy one is peer reviews. If your organization is big enough that you have more than one developer, having those developers work together with peer reviews and look through the code to make sure that you're putting human eyes towards the generative code and making sure that code is correct, that's one of the easiest things that you can do if you're not going to do anything else. Another thing that I found that is incredibly useful for our junior engineers is to really step up our code coverage and to do more with unit testing. Writing a good unit test means that you understand, and a lot of times you write unit tests before you actually write the generative code or use generative code or write the code that's going to actually be tested using that unit test. But writing a good unit test means that you understand the things that are inbounds and out of bounds. And by creating that logic, even if you don't understand the fullness of the generative AI, and I'm hoping that you do, the code that's generated, writing a really strong unit test can allow us to make sure that even without that understanding, that we're validating the code does the things that we expect it to do, or that if there is something that happens out of bounds, that particular logic happens or works the way that we expect it to do. This can also be a great way to train your junior engineers to better understand the expectations of the output, as opposed to becoming super reliant and just trusting blindly that the AI is going to do everything that's necessary. Another thing that I find to be incredibly useful are a series of tools out there that are code dependency analyzers. For those who do JavaScript, this is a big deal. A lot of JavaScript projects will pull in tons of dependencies and using NPM or other tools that are out there. When we're talking about those types of dependencies, what you want to make sure is that you're enforcing and using the same versions of those dependencies and libraries across the board. So these dependency analyses will make sure that if ChatGPT suggested that you use one dependency versus one that's already in your code set, that it first flags the fact that you should be using something that already exists. And also it will make sure that everything's using the proper versions and keep your applications production ready whenever a new build happens. Linting is another great option. Linters, when built into your CI and CD pipeline, will verify that the code that's being written by your developers not only is consistent, but it will also help look for certain patterns. Some of the linting tools that we've set up with things like GitLab as well as GitHub will check to see for insecure circumstances of patterns, like, for example, embedding a password or API key directly in code as opposed to externalizing those assets. We use NowSecure's tools for a lot of our mobile applications to do static code analysis, and also make sure that we're checking to see if there are malware or other components that are somehow made it into the binary before we execute it. I still think for very highly secure projects, this is one of the things that you can always do to make sure that the applications that you deliver are truly secure. We do a lot of mobile application development for the utilities industry, which is very subject to a lot of security scans and requirements. And so this has been essential in making sure that even if we use open source libraries, that we're making sure that our applications hit all of those requirements and check all of those different boxes. If you really decide that you're just not going to allow it, there are some tools out there that are also AI code detectors. These AI code detectors can check to see if the code that you're pushing in looks as if it's been generated with AI and provide warnings and flags based on that. I do warn that this is still, a race to see who can make the best tester versus, what's already there. So you have to be a little bit conscious that it's not going to be a catch-all and catch everything, but it can help to slow down the path if you're not ready to make this happen. The last two on here, security analyzers, which are pretty I think you can understand this based on that description. They are going to look for potential security flaws in the code that's written. And the last one here is license compliance detectors. A big thing that happened unexpectedly with a lot of these generative AI is pulling in libraries that are part of GPL or other licenses without us necessarily understanding what the impact is of the code that we've written. The last thing you want to do is suddenly take an entire commercial project and make it open source by not understanding the license requirements that you've agreed to. There are a series of tools within the CI and CD pipeline that can warn based on licensing docs that included in the source code what the impact may be to your greater source code base. So with that, I hope that this has been truly helpful, but I also want to open it up to Q&A and see if there's anything else that I could help you out with.
Awesome, Jason. Thank you so much for joining us today. We can definitely jump into Q&A, and I can actually grab the first one, which was a question that came in from Dan. And the question was, will we be providing the slides? So everyone who attended today's session will be getting the recording of today's session via email. We also have all of the TechTalk recordings available on NowSecure Academy. We have an anonymous question here that says, recently it hit the news that AI was impersonating people's voices to call and scam. How do we filter for this at work?
Social engineering, and especially the deep fakes, is a real problem. I mean, there have been a lot of examples of video and audio being used to impersonate folks. I think that the tools to actually detect this, they're still too early. It's right now, I think it's a space that I don't think that we're prepared for. And some of the challenge that we're going to have with the rapid speed of AI development is that there are a lot of things that will allow us to take advantage of individuals. That's going to take a little bit longer for the security infrastructure and to get in place to really protect and safeguard us.
Awesome. Bob shared more feedback than a question. He said, I wasn't sure what to expect going into this talk, but this has been a very good and very practical, very applicable talk. Thank you, Jason. So I wanted to give you that feedback.
Thank you.
We also have a question here from Mike, which says, which options are safest for organizations? Models that do not take in outside code, or models trained on the most code available?
So OpenAI has ChatGPT, which you can, at a paid version, lock down to prevent any proprietary code or other assets that you're pumping in from being shared with others. But the normal free and default versions do not do that. I think what we've started to do is to warn Mindgrubbers to not use the free tools, especially if we need to share information about clients or other items, to make sure that we're keeping that proprietary and only using that with paid versions that have walls to protect the information that's being shared with it. Copilot does also provide protections. It's important to look at the license agreements to make sure. Code Whisperer can too. But right now, a lot of these AI tools are also asking to retrain their models. And what's important is to make sure that you're looking at the licensing instruction, the licensing that's there, to see if or if not in terms of the sharing policies, especially if you're providing information that's being used to create the generative AI that you're working with. Otherwise, I do suggest that you try to keep it more anonymized and then use it as a kind of a starter, and then start to customize it based on proprietary data after the fact.
Awesome. We have one other question here that says, is there a way to use prompt writing when trying to use tools like ChatGPT or Copilot to ensure that the output is more secure?
Yes. This was something that I started to go on and talk about a whole lot more, but specifically with ChatGPT, the phrasing can go a long way. There are some very good prompts out there that folks are starting to develop, almost cookbooks that have specific phrasing of prompts that can help you out. Asking for it to make sure it encrypts the password, or telling it very specifically how you want something to happen, or going back and taking a snippet of code and telling it to make it more secure, really does make a difference. And it remembers within the context of a specific conversation thread. So you can definitely get better at writing much more secure prompts that are going to give you better content or better generative AI code. Copilot is not quite as built with the prompt approach. You can give it specific prompts, but it's really built to be more in line. So I find that with Copilot, it's giving you what it thinks is the best context or the best answer, and you can step through the different responses it gives. But sometimes it's a bit more hit or miss. because you can't refine it in the same way right now that you can with OpenAI's ChatGPT, where it's more conversational.
Awesome. And then we have one last question here about the slide that you had with the testing methods, I think. So it says you mentioned static code analysis and other security analyzers. What about testing the AI generated code after it's been compiled? Is testing at runtime?
Sure, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely you want to test it at runtime. A lot of these tools that, we may use in not only the CI pipeline, but I think these are also things that you can run against your code before you execute it. I tend to shy away from taking a large chunk of executable code from the internet, flopping it in and just running it. I at least try to read through and decipher it beforehand. I highly recommend folks do that as well. There are some really crazy tools out there that will allow you to describe something and it will create generative AI, run it and execute it without you having to do anything as a human. That idea frightens me still. So I do recommend that you at least read and understand what you're doing, because there is the possibility that there is something that is unexpectedly there that or that the code may run in a way that you didn't anticipate.
Awesome. Well, Jason, thank you again so much for coming and joining us today. This was really awesome for me, and I really enjoyed this talk. All quick friendly reminder for all folks who've joined today. This is a monthly series, so feel free to join us next month as well. And yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for joining, and Jason for hosting.
Thank you for joining. I appreciate it.